Tension rippled across the region today as a stunning development shook Moscow's trade lifeline. Turkey has abruptly shut down key border crossings and restricted passage through critical straits, leaving dozens of Russian-linked ships stranded in a geopolitical chokehold. From the very first hours of the announcement, the world witnessed a dramatic slowdown in maritime movement, a rare moment where silence at sea spoke louder than diplomatic statements. The question echoing across global capitals was simple yet alarming. What triggered this sudden freeze? And perhaps more importantly, what comes next? Turkey's sudden closure of border crossings and tightened restrictions across the straits sent an unmistakable shockwave through Moscow, striking at the very heart of its supply routes and exposing the fragility of its regional dependencies. What made this move even more destabilizing was the element of surprise. Ankara delivered no formal warning, no gradual transition, no diplomatic softening. It was an abrupt strategic pivot that instantly forced Russian officials into reactive mode. In political corridors across Moscow, the question wasn't just why Turkey acted, but why now? That timing, sharp as a blade, is what transformed a logistical disruption into a full-blown geopolitical statement. This wasn't merely a shutdown, it was a message carved into policy, and it demanded immediate attention from every level of Russian administration. The shock deepened as the reality on the ground and at sea became clear. Ships carrying vital Russian cargo were halted mid-route, their progress frozen under Ankara's new security measures. For years, Turkey represented one of Russia's remaining windows to the world amid tightening Western restrictions, a corridor through which energy, food, and industrial goods could move with relative predictability. Overnight, that predictability vanished. The element of unpredictability becomes the real hook here. When a nation's most dependable transit partner suddenly closes the door, the ripple effect isn't just economic, it's psychological. It forces a recalculation of alliances, assumptions, and strategies that had long been considered stable. Russian analysts quickly recognized that this wasn't a simple administrative decision. It was a power move, one crafted with precise political intention. Turkey has increasingly positioned itself as a geopolitical swing state, balancing its ties between Russia and NATO, leveraging geography as its most valuable asset. By shutting down crossings without prior notice, Ankara demonstrated the full extent of that leverage. Moscow, caught off guard, must now confront the reality that it no longer has guaranteed access through a region that once functioned as a semi-reliable escape route from isolation. This shock is amplified by the symbolism. When a bridge suddenly closes, you're not just stuck, you're reminded who controls the bridge. Behind the scenes, Russian policymakers are scrambling to decode the layers of this move. Was it a response to recent military tensions, a negotiation tactic aimed at broader international talks, or a calculated demonstration of Turkey's shifting priorities? Each possibility weighs heavily because each one implies a different future challenge for Moscow. As the political dust swirls, one truth emerges with striking clarity. Turkey's sudden closure wasn't just a border decision. It was a strategic interruption that jolted Moscow into recognizing how quickly regional loyalties can change and how vulnerable even large powers become when geography is weaponized with flawless timing. The moment Turkey enacted its tightened control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the maritime world felt the impact almost instantly. What unfolded wasn't just a routine slowdown, it was a dramatic and visually striking gridlock of vessels, many of them tied to Russian trade, suddenly immobilized in two of the world's most strategically essential waterways. The sight alone became a powerful hook, rows of ships waiting in tense silence, their navigation systems active yet directionless, as if the sea itself had paused. For global observers, this wasn't merely a logistical snag, it was a geopolitical freeze captured in real time. The magnitude of the buildup signaled something far deeper than typical maritime congestion. It was a reminder that when these straits stop moving, the world feels the tremors. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles are not ordinary channels. They're the heartbeat of regional commerce, the narrow corridors through which military, energy, and trade flows pulse between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. For Russian-linked vessels, these straits function like arteries. Block one and the system slows. Block both and the system strains. As ships queued with rising impatience, the pressure quickly shifted from the water to diplomatic tables. The standoff at sea transformed into a powerful visual metaphor for geopolitical tension. Steel giants, floating yet trapped, capable yet powerless, waiting for political winds to shift. Every hour they remained idle translated into growing financial losses, delayed deliveries, and mounting anxiety among port authorities and shipping companies across the region. Maritime analysts began issuing early warnings as the backlog widened. If the gridlock persisted, it could evolve into a full-scale supply chain disruption that would hit not only Russia, but also several European and Middle Eastern markets dependent on smooth transit. This potential domino effect added yet another layer of urgency to the situation. Suddenly, the image of stranded vessels wasn't just about Russia's predicament, it was about the fragility of global trade networks, networks that depend on the uninterrupted flow of these narrow passages. The tighter Turkey held its grip, the more global markets braced for impact, knowing that the world has learned, sometimes painfully, that even a small disruption in a choke point can trigger massive downstream consequences. What made the scenario even more compelling was the silence from many of the stranded ships' crews. No political statements, no public frustration, only the eerie stillness of halted commerce. This silence amplified the tension, giving the buildup an almost cinematic weight. It was the kind of moment that makes analysts pause and rethink the balance of regional power. Turkey's control over these straits has always been significant, but this event showcased just how much influence it can exert when it chooses to. Through the silent, growing fleet stuck in limbo, the world witnessed a powerful demonstration. Maritime choke points are more than passages. They are political instruments, and in the hands of a strategic player, they can shift the rhythm of international relations in an instant. The moment Turkey tightened transit through its straits, Russia felt a tightening of its economic pulse. Every delayed vessel, every stalled shipment, every hour of immobility became a reminder of how vulnerable Moscow's supply lines truly are beneath the surface. What makes this moment so gripping is not just the slowdown itself, but the timing. arriving at a point when Russia's economy is already balancing between sanctions, restricted markets, and escalating logistical pressures. The sudden halt struck like a direct hit on Russia's trade arteries, forcing analysts and policymakers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even a short-term disruption in these waters can magnify into a major strategic setback. The hook here is unmistakable. Turkey didn't need to impose sanctions, issue threats, or deliver public warnings. All it had to do was pause the flow, and the consequences began unfolding on their own. Energy shipments were among the first to feel the strain. Russia's oil and natural gas exports rely heavily on maritime channels for delivery to key buyers, and any delay in these high-value cargoes ripples outward with speed. A ship stranded for 12 hours is manageable. A ship stranded for 2 days becomes a problem. Dozens of ships stranded simultaneously become a crisis. Refinery schedules tighten, buyers grow anxious, and futures markets begin to twitch. Even minor fluctuations in Russian energy delivery can trigger price movements far beyond the region, giving this standoff an economic reach that extends well past the Black Sea. And for Moscow, every delayed barrel, every late delivery becomes a diplomatic disadvantage at a time when reliability is essential. Agricultural and industrial goods compound the pressure. Wheat shipments, one of Russia's strongest export pillars, rely on predictable transit through these straits. When those shipments stall, importers begin to question timelines, storage facilities adjust their expectations, and competitors quietly look for openings. The same applies to metals, machinery, and chemical supplies that depend on maritime movement. Russia's internal logistics can withstand strain, but its external trade pathways are far more delicate, especially when controlled by a foreign power with shifting priorities. This vulnerability becomes even more pronounced as global markets observe the situation. Investors, always sensitive to geopolitical signals, begin recalibrating risk models, factoring in the possibility that Russia's export chain might see more unexpected interruptions in the near future. The psychological impact may be the most underestimated. For years, Russia believed it could rely on Turkey as a crucial bridge, flexible, complex, but ultimately dependable. This shutdown shattered that assumption in a single stroke. Suddenly, every future trade decision must be made with a new question in mind. What if the straits close again? That uncertainty itself is a form of economic pressure, one that lingers long after the ships begin moving again. It reshapes planning, restructures strategies, and forces Moscow to consider fallback options that may take years to develop. Turkey's move didn't just slow Russian shipments, it exposed how vulnerable those shipments truly are, turning a moment of congestion into a powerful display of economic leverage with far-reaching implications. Turkey's decision to shut down crossings and restrict strait access was officially framed as a security measure. But the subtlety of far greater weight than the public explanation suggests. What makes this moment so compelling is the dual audience Ankara appears to be speaking to. On one side, the message targets Moscow, a reminder that Turkey controls one of Russia's most critical trade corridors and can tighten or loosen that control at will. On the other side, it signals to NATO and Western partners that Turkey remains capable of decisive action that aligns with broader strategic interests. when it chooses to. This dual direction signal is the real hook in this geopolitical development. Ankara isn't simply closing crossings, it's showcasing its position as an independent power capable of recalibrating regional dynamics with a single policy shift. For years, Turkey has balanced itself between Russia and the West, maintaining cooperation with Moscow while simultaneously engaging with NATO military structures. This balance has given Ankara leverage, allowing it to extract concessions, negotiate deals, and position itself as a gateway between competing powers. The sudden shutdown magnifies that leverage. By taking a step that immediately affects Russian trade flows, Turkey demonstrates its ability to influence Moscow's economic tempo without resorting to open confrontation. At the same time, the move sends a subtle but unmistakable signal to Western capitals that Turkey can be a decisive player in moments that matter. It is this strategic ambiguity, this ability to push pressure points on both sides, that strengthens Turkey's standing at every negotiation table. Behind closed doors, diplomats and political analysts are already dissecting the deeper motives. Some believe Ankara is maneuvering for broader concessions from Russia, military concessions in Syria, energy pricing advantages, or expanded influence in the Black Sea corridor. Others argue that Turkey may be signaling dissatisfaction with recent Russian actions, using the Straits as a controlled point of pressure. Then there are those who see this as a message directed toward NATO, especially at a time when Turkey seeks recognition of its regional security demands, military autonomy, and strategic importance. Whatever the interpretation, one fact is clear: Turkey understands the power of timing, and it chose a moment when the regional climate was volatile enough for this action to resonate loudly across multiple capitals. This decision also reinforces Ankara's core geopolitical doctrine: geography as power. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles are not simply waterways, they are instruments of influence. When Turkey exercises control over them, global powers take notice. This event reaffirms that Ankara's influence does not depend on military escalation or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it is a single administrative decision that can shift the geopolitical balance. The world sees the stalled ships, but the real impact lies in the strategic message: Turkey remains a central player whose choices reverberate far beyond its borders, and both Moscow and NATO must navigate carefully when Ankara decides to flex its geopolitical muscles. Global markets reacted almost instantly to Turkey's sudden shutdown of its crossings and tightened control over the Straits, a reaction that revealed just how fragile the world's economic systems become when a major geopolitical artery slows down, or a major geopolitical artery slows down. What makes this event so gripping is the uncertainty it injects into an already volatile global environment. Investors, traders, and policymakers were jolted by the realization that even a localized maritime disruption could escalate into widespread market turbulence. The hook is undeniable: a single decision in Ankara has the power to shift energy prices in Europe, elevate shipping costs across the Middle East, and unsettle commodity markets in Asia. This is not just a regional issue. It is a global economic tremor radiating outward through every supply chain that depends on timely maritime flow. Energy markets were among the first to react. Russia remains one of the world's major exporters of oil and natural gas, And the moment shipments stalled in the straits, prices began edging upward. Traders understand the sensitivity of these commodities. Even a hint of delay can trigger speculative activity that pushes costs higher. The possibility that Russian energy could face prolonged transit issues introduces a level of unpredictability that energy-dependent economies cannot afford. This vulnerability becomes a catalyst for market movements, with hedge funds repositioning, energy buyers scrambling for alternate suppliers, and analysts warning that a prolonged blockage could cause secondary disruptions in refining schedules and distribution networks. Every hour of delay feeds market anxiety, and every day of uncertainty amplifies the global economic impact. Commodity markets felt similar stress. Wheat, metals, fertilizers, and industrial goods, all staples of Russia's export economy, depend on these maritime routes to reach buyers. When those shipments stall, buyers begin seeking backup sources, often at higher prices. This shift in demand can push global market valuations into sudden spikes. Shipping insurers also begin recalculating risk premiums, raising insurance costs for vessels operating near the affected regions. These rising expenses inevitably translate into higher consumer prices down the line, affecting everything from food supplies to manufacturing costs. What began as a geopolitical decision by Turkey quickly becomes a chain reaction touching nations that have no direct stake in the dispute. The financial world, always alert to early warning signs, responded with heightened caution. Stock indices in several countries saw increased volatility as investors assessed the ripple effects. Currency markets reacted as well, especially in nations tied to energy imports or export-driven economies vulnerable to supply delays. The uncertainty surrounding the duration of Turkey's restrictions created an environment ripe for speculation, a scenario markets fear most. Analysts began urging governments to monitor the situation closely, warning that a sustained blockage could reshape economic forecasts for the quarter. In this moment, the global market's reaction serves as a powerful reminder of how interconnected modern economies have become. Maritime bottlenecks are no longer isolated logistical issues. They are global triggers capable of reshaping financial landscapes. Turkey's shutdown didn't just create a regional slowdown. It reminded the world that a single choke point, when tightened at the right time, can send shockwaves across continents, economies, and futures markets with extraordinary speed. As the ships remained stuck in the straits and diplomatic channels grew tense, global leaders quickly recognized that Turkey's sudden move had the potential to ignite far more than maritime delays. It could escalate into a broader political confrontation if not managed with care. What makes this moment so gripping is the urgency surrounding every diplomatic conversation. Each hour of silence from Ankara or Moscow fuels speculation, raises uncertainty, and pushes the international community toward a heightened state of alert. The hooks in this developing situation are powerful. Two influential regional players, an essential maritime choke point, and a world watching closely to see whether dialogue will prevail or division will deepen. This is where diplomacy becomes not just a tool, but a lifeline. The first calls for de-escalation came from European capitals deeply dependent on the flow of goods through the straits. For them, this wasn't a distant geopolitical issue, it was a direct threat to national supply chains. European diplomats urged both Turkey and Russia to open communication channels immediately, warning that any miscalculation could trigger market volatility, logistical crisis, and political strain. Meanwhile, NATO leaders viewed Turkey's move through a different lens. Some saw it as an assertion of autonomy, others as a message to Moscow, or even as a subtle demonstration of Turkey's relevance within the alliance. These varied interpretations only intensified the diplomatic urgency as each nation sought to understand Ankara's true intentions behind the shutdown. Russia, on the other hand, found itself in a delicate position. While officials publicly downplayed the disruption, privately they recognized the strategic disadvantage. Any aggressive response risked further isolating Moscow, while a passive stance risked appearing weakened. This internal tension pushed Russian diplomats into rapid coordination efforts, reaching out not only to Turkey, but to regional partners who might help mediate. The political weight of the moment forced Moscow to tread carefully, testing its ability to balance assertiveness with restraint, an increasingly difficult task in an environment where every signal is scrutinized. International organizations, including the UN and OSCE, began monitoring the situation as well, recognizing that maritime disruptions often foreshadow broader political escalations. Their involvement added another layer to the diplomatic landscape, transforming the crisis from a bilateral challenge into a multilateral balancing act. Analysts warned that if the shutdown continued, it could spark new regional alignments or strain existing alliances, particularly if one side perceived the blockade as a long-term strategic maneuver rather than a temporary security measure. What amplifies the tension even further is the unpredictability of Turkey's next move. Would Ankara open the crossings after a short diplomatic exchange, or would it hold its position to exert maximum pressure? This uncertainty kept global leaders on edge, monitoring statements, movements, and signals with extraordinary attention. In moments like these, diplomacy becomes a race against time, where every conversation, every quiet negotiation, and every carefully chosen word carries the weight of preventing escalation. The world isn't just watching Turkey and Russia, it's waiting to see whether global diplomacy can withstand yet another test in an already unstable era. As this high-stakes maritime standoff continues, global leaders are urging de-escalation before the economic fallout becomes irreversible. The world has seen transport bottlenecks before, but rarely one that lands at the crossroads of two key regional powers with such volatile timing. For now, all attention remains fixed on Ankara's next move and Moscow's response. Will the ships be cleared, or is this the beginning of a deeper rupture? One thing is certain, the straits may be narrow, but the impact of this shutdown stretches far wider than anyone expected.